The ground tells the truth before anything else does. She knows this the way she knows her own breathing, without having to think about it, without having to be told. And so on the morning the heat has finally settled in, like something permanent, like something that has decided to stay, she walks the length of her south field, with her boots pressing slow into earth that gives beneath her the way good bread gives beneath a thumb. Dark and soft and faintly cool, even now, even under a sky that looks bleached white at the edges. She presses her heel down and watches the impression hold its shape. Clean, firm, alive. Across the road, her neighbor's corn is already showing the signs. She doesn't have to look hard to see it. The leaves beginning to curl at their tips, rolling themselves inward like paper held too close to a flame. The soil over there has gone pale. Not just dry, pale, the way soil goes when it has given up the last of what it was holding and has nothing left to surrender. The rows crack along their centers in thin white lines, and the lines spread, and the spreading makes a pattern that looks like something breaking apart from the inside. She turns back to her own rows. Her boot presses in again, and the earth receives it. She thinks sometimes that she should feel something sharp about the difference, some edge of satisfaction maybe, or even a little pride. She doesn't. What she feels is quieter than that and harder to name. Something like the feeling you get when you finally understand what your grandmother was actually teaching you when you were too young to know you were being taught anything at all. That feeling takes her back to the day she first heard the mill had closed. It was not news that arrived gently. News like that rarely does in a small valley where everything is connected to everything else, where a closed mill means a stopped road, means a chain of smaller losses that ripple outward like a stone dropped in still water. She heard it at the feed store from the man behind the counter who was already calculating what it would mean for his own orders. She heard it again from two women talking outside the post office. She heard the word finished used the way people use it when they mean something worse than finished. She walked home thinking about the wool, not the spinning, not the yarn, not any of the things the mill had actually been built to produce. She thought about the 500 bags of rejected fleece she had glimpsed once through the side door of the mill, greasy and matted and stacked to the rafters in the back room, the kind of wool no spinner wanted, the kind that had been accumulating for years because no one had any use for it. She thought about what raw lanolin does to soil when it is held close to it long enough. She thought about moisture. She thought about the long, dry summers that always came. And she turned down the road toward the mill. The mill owner had posted a notice on the front door 2 days before she arrived. She read it standing in the road, the draft horse shifting his weight behind her, the flatbed wagon creaking once and going still. The notice was written in the kind of careful hand that men use when they want to appear calm, about something that is not calm at all. It said the mill was permanently closed, effective immediately, and that all remaining inventory and equipment would be handled at the owner's discretion. She walked around the side of the building to the loading door she had passed a dozen times without stopping. She knocked, and after a moment, the mill owner himself opened it, a stout man with a red face and the particular confidence of someone who has spent many years being right about practical things. He looked at her, then at the wagon, then back at her. She asked him about the wool in the back room. The 500 bags. He laughed, not unkindly but fully, the way a man laughs when he thinks a question has answered itself. He told her those bags were not wool, not really, not in any useful sense. Greasy, he said, matted, coarse. The kind of fleece his sorters had been pulling out for years, and setting aside because no spinner would touch it, No mill could process it cleanly. No buyer had ever once made a serious offer. He had been meaning to burn the lot of them. She said she would haul them away for him. He stopped laughing only long enough to look at her again, more carefully this time, deciding whether she understood what she was saying. Then he laughed again and called back into the dim building to someone she couldn't see, and the story passed from one person to the next, the way stories do in small places. By the time she led the horse to the feed store that afternoon for a bag of oats, it had already arrived. The man behind the counter had heard. 2 farmers near the back of the store had heard. One of them asked her, with a grin he was not quite bothering to hide, whether she planned to spin the grease into gold. The other said he supposed a person could always use 500 bags to fill a swamp. The man behind the counter smiled into his ledger and said nothing, which was its own kind of comment. She paid for the oats and did not explain herself, because she had learned early that explanations given before results are only arguments, and arguments are almost never the point. What she knew, what she had been turning over since she first saw that side room, since she first caught the heavy lanolin smell of those neglected fleeces, was simpler than any of them would have believed, even if she had said it plainly. Greasy wool does not let go of water easily. Matted fibers hold the earth around them like a closed hand. The summers in this valley were always long, and they were always dry. She went back to the mill the next morning with the wagon. The mill owner was already outside when she came up the road, leaning against the gate post, with his arms folded and his thumbs hooked into his suspenders, as though he had been expecting this kind of entertainment, and was pleased it had arrived on time. He was a stout man with a habit of carrying his satisfaction visibly, like a watch chain. He watched her bring the wagon around and set the brake, watched her climb down and take her horse by the bridle to settle him in the shade beside the fence. Then he called over to the 2 men sitting on the loading dock, mill hands waiting to be paid their final week, and said something that made them both laugh before she had touched a single bag. She heard the laugh. She did not look up. The side room where the bags were stored was dim and close, the smell thick enough to feel against the skin. 500 bags, each one packed with coarse rejected fleece, each one gleaming faintly with lanolin in the strips of morning light that came through the plank gaps. They were not light. Some of them were awkward to grip, slipping a little under her hands. But they were stackable, and the wagon bed was wide, and she had loaded heavy things before. She started from the back of the room and worked forward. By the time she had carried the first dozen out, the mill owner had moved himself closer, unable, apparently, to watch from a distance when he could watch from close up. He told her that the smell would soak into her wagon wood, and she would never get it out. He told her the grease would go rancid in summer heat. He said she might as well haul home a pile of swamp mud and see what that grew her. When she did not answer, he answered himself. Nothing, he said. Nothing is what a person grows from garbage, excepting maybe flies. One of the dock men laughed again. She set a bag on the wagon bed and went back inside. She found a rhythm in the work, the way she always did, the kind that settles into the shoulders and hips, and makes thought easier rather than harder. Carry, set, carry, set. The horse stood patient in the shade. The lanolin on her palms made her hands slick and then warm. She could feel the weight of the whole room ahead of her, and it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a number she was working toward. The mill owner eventually ran out of things to say, which was the truest sign that a man had made up his mind about something and no longer needed to think about it. He watched for a while longer in silence. then went inside his office. She heard the door. By mid-morning, the wagon was loaded as high as she safely dared, and she was filthy to the elbows, and the horse was ready to move. She had made the first real dent in 500 bags. 2 more days like this still ahead of her. The second day was wetter. A thin drizzle had come in overnight. Not enough to call itself rain, just enough to make the road soft, and the wagon wheels pull harder against the mud. The horse leaned into the collar without complaint, which she appreciated more than she could have said out loud. She had been up, before light, eating cold biscuit and checking the hitch by lantern, and by the time the sky had gone from black to gray, she was already a mile down the valley road, heading back toward the mill. The bags came out of her count easy now. She had slept with the number in her head and woken with it still there, clean and exact. 212 moved, 288 left. The world had a shape when you broke it into numbers like that. She passed the Greer place on the first run back. A man was standing at his fence line, collar turned up against the drizzle, watching his own field go soft. He looked at the wagon, looked at the bags she'd already stacked there, and shook his head in the slow, deliberate way people do when they want to be sure you see them doing it. She kept her eyes on the road. On the second run, coming back loaded, she passed him again. He had moved to his gate by then. He called out that she might as well plant those bags in the ground and see what grew. Nothing, he said, was his answer, since he figured she hadn't worked it out herself. He laughed at his own joke, and she let the sound of it fall behind her in the mud. 246 moved, 254 left. Her arms ached in the place behind the elbow that only woke up under long lifting work. Her boots had taken on water at the left sole and made a soft sound with every step. The lanolin had worked itself so deep into her palms that the drizzle beat it off her hands instead of soaking in, which she found useful and a little funny and kept to herself. A woman from down near the crossroads stopped her cart on the third pass and asked gently enough what on earth she meant to do with all of it. She said she meant to use it. The woman waited as though more explanation might arrive, and when it didn't, she clicked her tongue softly and drove on. 301 moved. By the end of the second day, the sky had gone purple, and the road behind her was rutted with her own wheel tracks, deep enough to hold water. She walked the horse slow and counted the bags on the wagon without touching them, just letting her eyes move across them. Each one settled against the next in a way that felt solid, not scattered, not wasted. 199 left. She would finish tomorrow. She did not let herself think past that. Not yet. The number was enough. The number was the whole point right now. The neighbor's wife comes on a Tuesday morning, which is how she will remember it later. A Tuesday, bright and already warm before 8, with the kind of light that flattens shadows and makes everything look slightly more real than it is. The woman stops her cart at the fence line and does not call out. She just stands in the road and stares at the rows. They are green, unreasonably, almost embarrassingly green, while the fields to the east have begun to show that first pale yellowing at the blade tips, while the kitchen gardens along the valley road have started to look tired and thirsty and slightly apologetic. These rows run dark and lush and even, the way rows look in early June before the heat remembers itself. The neighbor's wife puts one hand on the fence post and just looks. It started with the trenches. On the morning after the last wagon load, she woke before the sky was light and walked the field with a spade, cutting narrow furrows the length of each row, just deep enough to hold a layer of the matted wool flat against the soil. She did not rush it. She pulled the bags open one by one and spread the fleece by hand, pressing it down into each trench until it sat dense and even, then drew the earth back over it in a low ridge. The lanolin held the moisture in the wool the way a sponge holds water, not by trapping it against stone, but by pulling it in slowly and releasing it back even slower, the way the soil underneath stays cool on a hot afternoon, long after the surface has gone dry and pale. For the seedlings, she worked differently. She laid the wool flat on top of the ground in wide pressed mats, cutting hand-sized holes where each plant came through, and the mats settled around the stems, like something that had always been there. Weeds that managed to push up at the edges pulled out easily, finding no purchase under the thick fibers. The coarser fleece she saved. She had already begun pressing it into thicker forms, working it by hand along a flat board. In the evenings, after the light was gone, layering and pressing and letting the natural oils do what they had always done, binding fiber to fiber without thread. These were not decorative things. They were tools, dense, water-holding, slow-releasing, and almost impossible to dry out in the ordinary way of summer. She buried wool under every row. She laid wool under every seedling. She pressed wool into mats and stacked them along the barn wall and continued pressing more. The neighbor's wife is still at the fence when she comes up from the far end of the garden with a bucket. They look at each other across the green rows for a moment. The woman opens her mouth once and then closes it again, and what she finally says is simply, "How?" She sets the bucket down and wipes her hands on her apron and thinks about where to begin. She tells the neighbor's wife that the beginning is not where she thought it was. It started with a row of beans. This is weeks ago, not long after the last of the wagons was emptied and the bags were stacked against the barn. She had not buried everything at once. She is not that reckless, and she never has been. What she did first was test, quietly, without telling anyone, because she already knew what they would say if she told them she was running an experiment with greasy mill trash and a row of pole beans. She divided the row evenly. Half of it she tended the way she always had, turned soil, open air, hand-watered every morning from the well bucket. The other half she layered with the lanolin-heavy wool, pressing it down along the soil line the way you would tuck a blanket under something you wanted to keep warm. Then she watered both halves the same amount and waited. The dry spell came in 8 days, not because the drought had started yet, but because that is what late spring does sometimes in the valley. It forgets to rain for a stretch, and the topsoil goes pale and dusty at the edges, and the younger seedlings start to lean just slightly, searching. She watched both halves of the row every morning. She crouched at the open end and pressed 2 fingers into the soil and felt what was there. Dry within an inch. She did the same at the wool end. Damp, still damp. Cool even the way soil is after a night rain. But there had been no night rain. The wool was holding what had been put there, giving it back slowly, letting the roots pull from it instead of losing it to the air. By the end of the first week, the difference was impossible to miss if you knew how to look. The unprotected seedlings were still alive, but they were working hard. Stems thinner than they should be, leaves with that faint gray-green of stress. The wool-covered seedlings were darker, fuller, standing upright the way a well-watered plant stands, unhurried and sure of itself. By the end of the second week, the open row had wilted. Not dead, but bent and pale, and asking for something she would have to carry to it by hand twice a day. The wool row had not wilted, it had grown. She sat on her heels in the dirt between them for a long time that morning. She pressed her palm flat against the lanolin warm fiber and felt the moisture still underneath, and thought about all 500 bags stacked along the barn wall, and thought about the summer that was still coming. She knew then, not hoped, knew. She started burying wool under every row the next morning. She worked from first light until she could not see her hands. And then she worked a little longer by feel, pressing the fiber into the earth like something the soil had been waiting a long time to receive. The neighbor's wife is quiet for a moment after she finishes. The drought came the way bad things often do, not all at once, but leaning in. First the creek dropped a hand's width in a single week. Then the morning dew stopped coming. Then the sky went that particular shade of white that is not clouds and not sun, but a kind of blankness, as if the weather itself had turned away from the valley and decided not to return. By mid-July, the fields along the road had gone the color of old straw, and not just the edges where the soil was always thin. The whole length of them, hedge to hedge, pale and crackling underfoot. Farmers walked their rows with the slow dread of people doing math they don't want to finish. Wells that had never been low in living memory were low now. The feed store had a line out the door of men buying irrigation supplies they weren't sure would help. She kept working. Her fields held their green in a way that was almost unreasonable. She noticed it first from the rise behind the barn, where she went every morning to check the sky. Looking down from there, her rows were the deep, unhurried green of plants that had been drinking steadily all night. The wool underneath was doing what she had felt it doing since spring, holding the moisture against the roots, releasing it slowly, the lanolin in the fiber turning every drop of water into a gift that lasted. She did not walk out to the road. She did not wave at passing wagons or make any show of it. She just kept pressing wool, kept her rows, kept her hours. The first farmer knocked on her gate on a Tuesday morning, 7 weeks into the dry spell. She heard the knock from the kitchen and came out with her hands still dark from turning compost. He was a broad-shouldered man from 2 farms down the valley road, a man whose family had farmed that land longer than anyone in the area cared to count. He had a kind of quiet authority she had always respected from a distance. He stood at her gate and looked past her at the green rows and did not say anything for a moment. Then he said he had lost half his kitchen garden. His wife's tomatoes were finished, the beans were done, and the squash had burned off the vine in a single hot week. He looked at her rows again. He asked what she had done. She told him about the wool, not everything, not the whole spring of it, just the plain facts, the bags from the mill, the way the fiber held water, the lanolin, the way she had laid it under every row before the heat came. She watched his face move through something complicated. She had seen that look before. It was the look of a man recalculating. He asked if she had any to sell. She told him she did. He asked how much. She looked at her fields, then at his face, then back at her fields. She had been thinking about that question for 2 weeks already. She told him she would have an answer by morning. He nodded once and left the way he had come, and she stood at the gate a little longer than she needed to, watching the dust settle behind his boots on the dry road. The price question had been living in her head since the first neighbor had asked, but the shape of it kept changing. She did not want to be greedy. She also understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that she could not afford to be too generous. What she had made cost nothing in money and everything in time. That was the accounting she kept returning to. She went back to the barn. This was the part nobody saw and nobody thought to ask about, the part that happened after supper, when the light was low and her legs were already tired from the day. She had been at it for weeks. The coarser fleece, the bags whose fiber was too matted to lay flat under the rows, too bunched and tangled to press into the soil evenly. She had been working that wool into something else, something flat and dense and useful. She would pull a double handful from a bag, press it against the rough board she had braced across two sawhorses, and lean her whole weight into it, working the fibers together with her palms and the heels of her hands until they began to felt into one another. The lanolin helped. It made the fibers slick enough to shift, stubborn enough to hold once they locked. She would build up the layers slowly, handful by handful, until she had something roughly the thickness of a folded quilt, but far heavier, far more solid. Then she would trim the edges with the old shears and stitch a border with rough cord to keep the whole thing from pulling apart at the corners. They were not pretty. She knew that. They were dark and uneven, and they smelled of raw fleece and damp earth. But they held water the way a clay pot held water, slowly, reluctantly, releasing it back only when something needed it. She had tested them on the rows that got the worst afternoon sun, the rows she had been most worried about, and the soil under a mat stayed measurably cooler and damp for 2 full days longer than the exposed rows beside it. Her hands ached by the time the barn lamp burned low each night. The cord raised blisters on the inside of her right thumb that hardened into calluses over the first 2 weeks. She got faster. She found a rhythm. She learned exactly how much pressure and how long before the layers began to hold. And she stopped second-guessing and just worked. The stack against the back wall of the barn had grown past her waist now. She counted it every few nights, the way some people counted money. She knew what it was worth to a man who had just watched his wife's garden die. She just had not said the number out loud yet. She did not plan for Saturday to be the day. She had not sent word. She had not pinned a notice to the feed store board or asked anyone to spread it along the road. She had simply decided, somewhere around midnight on Friday, that the stack against the barn wall was tall enough, that her hands had done enough, and that if someone drove past in the morning and stopped, she would sell. Someone did more than stop. By the time she unlatched the gate at first light and propped it open with the old stone she kept for that purpose, there was already a wagon at the end of her drive. A woman from the lower valley, the one with the long kitchen garden that ran the length of her south fence. She had a look on her face that was not quite embarrassment and not quite desperation, but something between the two. The look of a person who has swallowed their pride in one long, uncomfortable gulp. By 7:30, there were 6 wagons on the road shoulder. By 8, there were 11. She carried the mats out from the barn in armloads and stacked them near the gate post, and the line moved steadily, quietly, without the noise she might have expected. These were not cheerful buyers. They were tired people who had watched their soil crack and their leaves curl and their careful summer work begin to fail. And they had come because they had no better idea and because someone along the road had told someone else that the girl with the wool had something that worked. She named her price and nobody argued. A few people counted coins slowly, carefully, the way you count when you are not certain you have enough, and she watched their faces and adjusted twice without making a point of it. The mats went fast, faster than she had imagined. She had stacked what she believed was more than enough, a count she had been proud of the night before, and by mid-morning she could see the bottom of the pile. She went back into the barn twice to bring out what remained from the far corner and the low shelf near the feed bin. By noon, the barn floor was clear and the gate stood open to nobody. The last wagon had turned onto the valley road 20 minutes before. She stood in the yard in the full heat, which was considerable, and looked at the empty space near the post where the stack had been. 4 hours, every mat gone. She thought about the number she had not yet said out loud. Then she looked at the 500 bags still stacked in the back barn, still waiting, still full of the greasy, matted coarse wool that the former mill owner had laughed about on a cold morning 3 weeks ago. She went inside and got a piece of paper and a stub of pencil, and she sat down at the table and began to think bigger. She sat at that table for a long time. The pencil moved slowly at first, then faster. She was not a woman who had spent much of her life with paper and numbers, but she understood amounts. She understood what a stack of mats had sold for in 4 hours. She understood what 500 bags still held. She wrote down a figure and then crossed it out and wrote it again, because she did not quite believe it the first time. Outside, the heat pressed down on everything. 3 days later, she was back at the gate by first light. A new stack beside the post, twice the size of the first. She had worked through 2 evenings to press them, pulling fleece from the bags, laying it flat, folding and tamping, until each mat held its shape. Her hands smelled of lanolin so deeply now that she had stopped noticing. The drafts from the barn no longer cooled her. She worked anyway. The line at the gate that morning started before she carried out the first mat. There were 6 wagons on the valley road by the time she propped the post open. 8 by the time the sun had cleared the ridge. Men who had not spoken to her since before the mill closed. Women who had watched her haul those bags and said nothing kind. A few who had said something unkind. They all stood in the same line. She did not make them feel it. She took what they offered and thanked them and handed over the mats and the soil blankets. And she meant the thanks, because the blankets were going into their gardens, and their gardens needed them, and that mattered more than the rest of it. She was handing a rolled mat to a woman near the back of the line when she heard it. A wagon slowing on the road, not turning in, just slowing. She knew the sound of his rig. She had heard it pass her gate a dozen times over the years, always at a good clip, the confident pace of a man with business to conduct. This was different. This was the pace of a man who had seen something that stopped him. She did not look up right away. She finished the exchange, took the coins, nodded her thanks. Then she looked toward the road. He was sitting there in the full sun, reins loose, stout frame motionless on the bench. His eyes were moving from the line at her gate to the fields beyond the fence, where the green ran steady and dark against a valley that was turning the color of dry straw everywhere else. His jaw was set in a way that was not quite pride anymore. There was something else working behind it. She had seen that look before on other faces. It was the look of a man revising something he had believed with great confidence not very long ago. He sat there a moment longer. Then he turned his wagon around. He came back the next morning. She heard his boots on the porch boards before she heard the knock. A heavy, deliberate step. The walk of a man who had made a decision and was committed to it now. She was at the work table pressing a new mat when the knock came. She set down the paddle, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to the door. He was holding his hat. That was the first thing she noticed. Not on his head, not pushed back, not tipped in casual greeting, held in both hands in front of him, turning slowly at the brim, the way a man holds a hat when he does not quite know what to do with his hands. She stepped onto the porch and waited. He said he had been thinking. He said the mill building was sitting empty and costing him in taxes, and he had no use for it and no buyer in sight. He named a price. It was modest, more than modest, she thought, for a building that size with a drying room and a loading dock and good solid walls. She held his gaze and did not let her face say what she was thinking. She asked one question. The back drying room, she said. The floor. Was it the original timber or had it been replaced? He blinked. He had not expected that to be the question. He said it was original, 30-year pine, solid as the day they laid it. She nodded once, then she said yes. He put his hat back on. Something shifted in his face, not quite relief and not quite regret, but a complicated mixture of both. The expression of a man who had gone looking for a small, dignified way out and found it, and was grateful and a little unsettled by that gratitude. They shook hands on the porch in the morning heat. After he left, she stood a moment in the yard. The cooperative had existed in her mind for weeks by then. The layout of it, the workflow, the women who might come to run it with her. She had already spoken to 2 of them in passing, the way you speak of a thing you are not quite ready to name aloud. One lived a quarter-mile east, a capable woman with strong hands and a failing vegetable stand she was quietly desperate to replace. The other lived at the hill farm, widowed the previous winter, steady and serious, and looking, you could tell, for somewhere to put her energy. She walked to the fence and looked out at the fields. The wool under her rows was still holding. She could feel it in the air above the soil, that faint, cool dampness that meant the roots below were drinking when every other field in the valley was begging. She went inside and wrote 2 short notes. The notes were short. They did not need to be long. By the time the afternoon cooled toward evening, she was already outside, moving along the rows the way she did most days now. Not checking exactly, not inspecting in the anxious way she had once inspected things, but walking, just walking. The sky went gold and amber behind the ridge, and the light came in low and level across the field, the kind of light that shows you the small things, the way a leaf holds itself, the faint sheen of moisture on dark soil, the particular stillness of plants that are not thirsty. Her plants were not thirsty. The wool lay beneath it all, invisible now, buried or pressed flat, under its weight of soil and weeks. You would not know it was there if you had not put it there yourself. But she knew. She could feel the difference in the air above each row, that soft breath of coolness, that quiet exhalation of ground that was still holding water while the sky gave nothing and the sun gave everything it had. Down the valley, the other fields were the color of straw by now. Here things were green, not boastfully green, just quietly, stubbornly, correctly green. She stopped at the far fence and leaned on the post, the way she often did at this hour. The ridge was going red at the edges. Somewhere in the field behind her, a cricket started and then stopped, and then started again, uncertain about the remaining warmth. Down the road, a quarter mile, maybe a little more, the old mill building sat open to the afternoon. She had propped the wide side door herself that morning because the women inside worked better with the air moving through. She could hear it now, or she told herself she could. The low, productive hum of that place doing something useful again. 3 women who had needed somewhere to put their hands, and their knowledge and their particular kinds of steadiness. work that had come from 500 bags of grease and lanolin and matted coarse fiber that a stout, self-satisfied man had once offered her with a laugh, certain she was the foolish one. She had not forgotten the laugh. She did not hold it against him, exactly. But she had not forgotten it. The cricket settled into its rhythm. The light finished going gold and began going rose. She stayed at the fence a little longer, not because she needed to, but because this was the part of the day she had started to love, the quiet confirmation of it, the proof that was not loud or dramatic or offered to anyone in particular, just there, in the temperature of the air above the soil, in the sound drifting down from the old mill, in the color of a field that had no business being this green. She had seen what the wool could do. She had been right about it. That was enough.